Hi, everyone. Thank you. Thank you for being here with us. I am truly honored on behalf of the Adam Smith Center for Economic Freedom to have this conversation with President Leonel Fernández of the Dominican Republic. We're going to have this as a conversation, but any great speaker deserves a great introduction. So Professor Eduardo Gamarra will do the honor of introducing President Fernández. Eduardo.
Thank you very much. Welcome to all of you. We're going to have President Fernández give us his vision of something that interests our class very much, Mr. President. I have with us a course called The Politics of Latin America. Most of the students here are undergraduate students, but with a great interest in Latin America. So I've known Dr. Fernández for, in fact, we were reminiscing this afternoon, about 40 years. And I guess that's saying a little bit about how, about our age. But I've known the president for many, many years. Had the privilege of working with him on a number of different important projects, and a lot of them in relationship to our university. This is, I don't know how many times the president has been here, but usually when the president comes here, he first thing he does is he goes to the bookstore, and everybody in the bookstore knows him because he generally buys half of the collection there to take home. So the president served as president of the Dominican Republic from 1996 to 2000, and then from 2004 until 2012. He also is the founder of a very, very important think tank called the Global Foundation for Development and Democracy, based in Santo Domingo, but which has offices in several places. New York, for example, and now here in Miami. And of course, Jose is the director, and so he would stand up. And we're working on doing we're developing some programs together as not only with your center, but also through the Latin American Center and the Gordon Institute here at FIU. So again, welcome to all, and Mr. President, again, a privilege to have you here. So now I'll turn it over to you for your.
Thank you, Eduardo. Thank you. All right. The president has been in many interviews, many academic settings. I think I first met him over 25 years ago when he came to give a talk at Harvard as president, and he gave a wonderful, academic talk. And I want to do something a little bit differently. I want to have a conversation with him not only as the former president of the Dominican Republic, but as Leonel. I want you to get to know the man behind the very important office that he held for 3 different periods, and who knows, might hold again at some point. He's eligible for 2 more terms, and so I want you to get to know him. And so I will ask a few questions about the Dominican Republic and about Latin America, about the U.S., but I also want to begin asking you about you, about your time in public service, about how you became interested in being a public servant. You've been in politics for a long time, so tell us, why politics, why public service?
Well, thank you, Carlos. Thank you, Professor Eduardo Gamarra, for your very kind introduction. Thanks to all of you for being here today. Well, let me tell you a little bit about that. I never thought of being a politician. I wanted to be a baseball player. That's what I wanted to be.
Tough competition from the Dominican Republic.
I came to New York when I was 8 years old, so I was raised in New York. And I used to go to Shea Stadium, right, where the Mets. Played all the National League baseball teams. And then we had a very high-profile Dominican ball player, the first Dominican to get into the Hall of Fame. His name is Juan Marichal. Mm-hmm. And I used to go to Shea Stadium to see Marichal pitching.
Who lives in Miami now.
Who lives in Miami now, that's right. And then I was really impressed. 45,000 fans at Shea Stadium, many of them waving the Dominican flag. So I associated sports with Dominican Republic while living in New York. So my first dream was becoming a baseball player. But I got into a deep slump. I was never able to get out of it, striking out all the time. So, a very early stage, I made the right decision to move forward into some other field. Interest perhaps in politics began at home in New York. My mother was a nurse, and also she worked as an operator, sewing machines in one of the factories in New York. And on weekdays, on Sundays or Saturdays, she will invite some of her friends that would come from other parts of New York, from Boston, where Dominicans used to live at the time. And they would speak about Dominican politics. And so I was 9, 10 years of age. I didn't pay much attention, but I know they were talking about Dominican politics. My mother was an avid reader. She would read Dominican newspapers, Dominican magazines, Dominican authors. So my family was always very much involved or interested in politics. But perhaps I would say the interest began when I returned to the Dominican Republic at the end of the 60s. Because I went into a neighborhood that really had an impact on me. That neighborhood called Villa Juana, in the capital city, Santo Domingo, most of the youth of the time was highly interested in politics and culture. So just about every night, they would go in the neighborhood, outdoors, and speak about different topics, basically about Dominican politics. So just coming from New York, more interested in baseball and sports in general, I began listening to them, and I was attracted by the way they spoke and the things they spoke about. So they began lending books, and so I began reading some of these books and became very much interested. I was beginning high school years. Most of these youngsters were already in college, and so they had an influence, creating an interest about Dominican politics. Of course, there was a natural environment to be interested in politics in the Dominican Republic at the time. We have had a long dictatorship from 1930 to 1961, Trujillo dictatorship. And then after that, we had Juan Bosch, who was the first democratically elected president after the dictatorship came down. And well, he was elected, he was overthrown by a military coup. In 1965, there was a popular uprising in the Dominican Republic to bring back Juan Bosch to power, but then it was the Cold War, and many analysts mistakenly thought it was going to be a second Cuba, which was not. It was more a democratic revolution that was taking place. And so there was a U.S. military intervention in the Dominican Republic in 1965. And so people were still talking about that intervention, and how we should regain our national sovereignty, our national identity as Dominicans. So there was a natural environment to speak about politics and become interested in politics and about culture, Dominican culture. I remember at the time I met the most important Dominican poet of the time, Pedro Mir. He would come to the neighborhood and speak and lecture, and so we were able to really get in touch with these kind of people that influenced my generation. So the interest, I would say, becoming aware about the importance of politics in the Dominican Republic began in my neighborhood. Now, officially, I began participating when I entered the university in 1971. Autonomous University of Santo Domingo, UAST in Spanish. And they had student groups. But those student groups were more linked to political parties, not like here in the US. You have a students' association, but it's more academics. It's more academic here, what students do. In the DR at the time, it was more political. So I began participating in a movement called Frente Universitario Socialista Democrático FUST, a social democratic student front. But it was linked to a party, the Dominican Revolutionary Party. So we began participating there. Juan Bosch returned to the Dominican Republic beginning the 70s, and he began speaking daily on radio, half an hour every day. He would speak not like a politician, but more as a professor. So I began listening to him, reading his books, and that's how I got more involved into politics at the beginning.
You mentioned briefly baseball. What is it about the Dominican Republic that produces so many great baseball players, more than any other Latin American nation?
Well, really, it's a miracle what we have had, no? The possibility of having Dominican ball players get into the major leagues in the 60s, they opened the door for the others. And now we have Major League Baseball academics operating in the Dominican Republic, about 24 of them. So just about every Major League Baseball team has an academic in the Dominican Republic. And some of our youngsters are signed as young as 16 years of age, 17 years of age. Or Sandy Alcantara won the Cy Young Award last year best patron national league. And so yes, Dominican, we call it baseball lands. Dominican Republic is baseball lands, really.
What role do you think government needs to play, a government like the Dominican government, in promoting things like the arts, sports, areas where in the US, for example, the government is not really involved?
Well, in our case, government has to play a very active and dynamic role because the private sector is not as developed as it is in a developed country, so government really takes care of that. In sports, related to sports, we have a sports ministry. And my sports minister was Juan Marichal. So you see how things connect. I used to see him playing here in the States, and then when I was able to when I was elected, then I appointed him as the first minister of sports because of his prestige and because of his connections here in the U.S. And I would say Dominican Republic is not only good in baseball, we're good in volleyball, we're very good in boxing, we're very good in softball, in martial arts, in football now. Well, we're beginning. We don't have a Pelé there yet, but eventually.
Not yet.
And so we say that Dominican Republic is not a world power, it is not a military power, it is not an economic powerhouse, but we are a sports powerhouse worldwide because we go to the Olympics, we get gold medals and silver medals, so it's a source of pride for the Dominican Republic to be so good in different sports.
Another area where the Dominican Republic really has excelled is in stability. For decades, the Dominican Republic has been remarkably stable politically, but also economically. We have a lot of students studying Latin American politics, and they would know that we have some regimes in Latin America that are politically stable, but economically unstable. Others that are politically unstable, but economically fairly stable. I think Peru comes to mind. Others that are politically unstable and economically unstable. Right. But the Dominican Republic is a model of political stability and economic stability. Since you were president the first time, there have been presidents of other parties, yet the macroeconomic stability has been remarkable. You welcome foreign investments regardless of who's in charge. What is the secret to that Dominican stability, both political and economic?
Right. We have gone through stages. Right after Trujillo's death, our main goal was freedom and democracy. We had the first experiment, as we said before, but it failed. The Bosch regime, the coup d'etat, the military uprising, it failed. Then we had Joaquin Balaguer, who has become a legend in Dominican politics. He governed from 66 to 78.
Into his 90s.
Until his 90s and blind.
Yeah, and blind.
And blind. So we had a blind president in the Dominican Republic. But brilliant man, great scholar, magnificent public speaker, like no one else. He would quote on the Greeks and the Romans out of the top of his head. So a very, very highly educated, cultivated man. As any politician, history will judge finally, but my belief is that it's more positive than negative, what he did for the country. Those 12 years, there was economic growth. The economy was expanding, even though politically it was semi-authoritarian, I would say that. So modern democracy in the Dominican Republic begins in 1978. We had free and fair elections at the time. I think President Jimmy Carter, we spoke about this before, influenced the Dominican electoral outcome in 1978. When President Carter came to office, he promoted a policy of human rights and free and fair elections in Latin America, and I think that had an impact in our country, alongside with other elements, other factors that were taking place outside the region. Remember that it was not only the Dominican Republic, but in the 60s and 70s, there were military coup d'etats everywhere, in Brazil, in Argentina, in Chile, everywhere. And politics was framed in terms of these are fascist governments, and we're struggling for a socialist transition. So it was either capitalism or socialism at the time. But many of these political leaders that were persecuted by the military regimes, they traveled over to Europe. Many stayed in Spain, others in Germany, others in Sweden, Switzerland. And at the time, I think three major events took place that influenced the Latin American leadership and the Dominican Republic political leadership as well. It was the death of Francisco Franco in Spain. This took place in 1876. And with the death of Francisco Franco, a democratic transition began to take place in Spain. Many Latin American leaders living in Spain at the time say, well, this makes sense. I think we can perhaps do the same thing in Latin America. So instead of fascism versus socialism, it became dictatorship versus democracy. The other was the fall of the military in Greece. And at the end also the fall of the family, the Salazar family in Portugal. Right? Another major element is when the socialist institution, el socialismo international socialism, in Europe was more Eurocentric. They opened the door, so traditional Latin American political parties would participate within the international socialists. And then you had leaders like François Mitterrand in France, Willy Brandt in Germany, and so they became interested in Latin American politics, and they influenced. So it was Carter, human rights policy, and free, fair elections. It was the European process of ending dictatorships and pivoting into democracies. Latin American political leaders were there, they were influenced, they came back, and then they had a new mindset about where the political struggle should move into. So the Dominican Republic was the first location, the first country in Latin America that made that transition, right, in 1978. And from there on, we've had free, fair elections for the last 40 plus years. So we have been able to understand, and I think there is a consensus among all political parties in the Dominican Republic, there's a consensus that you need to have stable democratic political system in order to have economic growth and have socio-economic development. And we can see the difference between Dominican Republic and our neighbor, Haiti. The problem with Haiti is that it doesn't have a democratic political stability system. It is undemocratic, it is unstable, and because of that, there's a lot of poverty, a lack of opportunities. And so we see that the solving current problems in Haiti needs to go by first stabilizing politically, creating democratic institutions. So if you have that, there will be confidence in investing in the country. Private, local investment, foreign direct investment in the country. And then we were also making a transition in terms of economic development. Dominican Republic, as just about every country in Latin America, were export-led countries. In our case, sugar, coffee, tobacco, etc. In the 70s and 80s, then there was a transformation more into a service-oriented economy. So we began promoting tourism, free trade zones, and free trade zones is manufacturing, but more export-led. So in those corporations, you would manufacture apparels, footwear, plastics, medical equipment, etc., and basically export it into the U.S. market on a duty-free basis. Originally, in the 70s and 80s, there was a program called the Caribbean Basin Initiative, CBI. And with CBI, we would export into the U.S. market textiles, apparel, and these other products I was speaking about. They would enter the U.S. market on a duty-free basis, unilaterally. So we didn't have to open our economy to import goods and services from the U.S. Now, in the 90s, at the end of the Cold War, the whole program was changed, and now it's bilateral. So we are part of what is called DR-CAFTA, Dominican Republic, Central American Free Trade Agreement, and because of that, we continue to export into the U.S. market, and now we also import from the U.S. market. Many products also duty-free. So this is how it plays out. So we have tourism and free trade zones and growth within the financial sector, commerce, and this has enabled the creation of an expanding middle class in the Dominican Republic. Another major factor is Dominicans abroad, especially here in the States. We have nearly 2 million Dominicans in the United States. We are 11 Dominicans back home, 2 million more abroad. And it's interesting because in the last census, what we see is that those 2 million, 1.1 million were born in the States, and only now 900,000 migrated to the United States. So what we see as a trend is that looking into the future, we'll have more children born of Dominican parents living in the States. This has also made a great contribution to the country because they send remittances, they send financial resources to the families and to the ties back home. Last year was record, $10 billion were sent by Dominicans living here to Dominicans at home. So it's tourism, it's free trade zones, it is remittances, and traveling, and all this has made a tremendous transformation into the Dominican Republic.
You mentioned the military dictatorships. For a couple of decades, you had a bunch of military dictatorships in Latin America. Then beginning in the 80s, we see that democracy began to arrive in many of these areas that had dictatorships. And we saw a new wave of democracies emerge all over Latin America. And so there was a lot of promise for democracy. People believed that democracy was the solution to Latin America. Now what we're seeing is that there's a bunch of regimes throughout Latin America that were elected initially democratically, Cuba, the clear exception, but others that were initially democratically elected regimes that have gone the authoritarian route and that have tried to remain in power repeatedly, whether you call them populist or different type of regime, most of them on the left. Do you think democracy has lost its luster? Are we seeing a return, maybe not to authoritarianism the old-fashioned way through dictatorships, but a new type of authoritarianism emerging in Latin America?
In a way, yes. Even though I think democracy still prevails in general terms, I would say those with authoritarian inclinations are the exception. Just about the rest of the countries are more democratically centered. The rule of law, constitutionalism, I think that prevails still today. Now, the thing is, who comes into power nowadays depends on global trends, global economic trends, and the influence they're having in the electoral political cycle in Latin America. This is something relatively new.
Porque creemos en el desarrollo de los pueblos y su gente, la Fundación Salvador Holguín da apertura a los cursos técnicos de electricidad, plomería, electrónica, reparación y fabricación de inversores totalmente gratis. Tu aporte solo es asistir a recibir las enseñanzas de profesores especializados en el área. Ya no hay justificación. Si no eres profesional o no tienes una carrera técnica, esta es tu oportunidad. La Fundación Salvador Holguín te espera con las puertas abiertas en El Pino de Jabón. Inscríbete al 849-457-4226.
George pasó y teníamos aproximadamente 10 años viviendo en la zona y nos mudamos en la misma semana porque la casa donde vivíamos fue destrozada por el ciclón. No teníamos agua en la casa, teníamos la tubería porque un vecino nos la prestó y era muy difícil para nosotros en crisis de agua no tener un agua directa. Una casa sin agua no se puede estar. El país ha cambiado. Esta gestión vinieron al barrio y nos pusieron el agua directamente de la tubería y ya nosotros tenemos agua, podemos lavar cuando queramos, limpiar la casa cuando queramos sin necesidad de tener el agua medida. Sentí el cambio.
tenemos un propósito que marcará un antes y un después en la historia de la República Dominicana. Despachar la mercancía que llega a nuestros puertos en 24 horas. Es un trabajo en equipo, un desafío que solo se puede enfrentar con entusiasmo y valentía. Nuestras aduanas están equipándose con los últimos avances tecnológicos porque solo con modernidad y eficiencia podremos agilizar los procesos operativos. Es un gran reto, pero si unimos nuestras voluntades, juntos podremos lograrlo.
Esta iniciativa impactará los índices de competitividad de nuestro país, favorecerá el comercio exterior y mejorará la calidad de vida de nuestra gente. Nos encaminamos a ser el hub logístico de la región. Es un propósito donde ganamos todos, pero sobre todo ganamos como país.
Despacho en 24 horas. Juntos a tiempo. Dirección General de Aduanas.
Con la brisita navideña vienen los mercados económicos de Inespre, con los productos básicos de la canasta familiar y los ingredientes de la cena navideña a precios justos, para que tengas una Navidad más feliz. Primero tu familia, primero tu alegría, primero tu Navidad.
Para cortar el plátano, gire el plátano 45 grados. Con precaución, haga una incisión en la cara de...
No. La verdad es que a la gente le gusta complicarse. Lo mismo pasa con el banco. Mira, tú tienes cuchumil cajero, canales para ti 24/7, subagentes, hasta el colmado de enfrente.
¡Colmado!
Una app que ni siquiera el internet te consume. Y aún así, hay gente que se da el viaje para el banco. Oye, no hay que complicarse, que los canales Banreservas están ahí para ti, cuando quieras.
No te compliques y utiliza los canales Banreservas, tu banco fuera del banco. Banreservas, el banco de todos los dominicanos.
Convencidos en que la tecnología e información son garantías de éxito y desarrollo de las personas en la era digital, la Fundación Salvador Holguín trae totalmente gratis a tu provincia de Jabón los cursos de informática e inglés para ponerte acorde con los tiempos y garantizar la capacitación y profesionalidad de sus compueblanos. Ya están abiertas las inscripciones. Llama ahora mismo al 849-457-4226. Fundación Salvador Holguín. Tecnología a tu alcance.
Y yo quiero decirle a los dajaboneros y dajaboneras en el día de hoy que Salvador Holguín tiene un sueño para con su pueblo. Que Salvador Holguín tiene aspiraciones para con su gente. Que Salvador Holguín está trabajando día y noche para acompañarles a ustedes junto a las autoridades del gobierno del presidente Luis Abinader para traerles soluciones a esta importante provincia que me vio nacer. Yo tengo un sueño para con Dajabón y estoy trabajando para cumplirlo. Yo tengo un sueño de desarrollo. Yo tengo un sueño de bienestar. Yo tengo un sueño de oportunidades para los jóvenes. Yo tengo un sueño para detener la haitianización que existe en esta frontera. Yo tengo un sueño para evitar la inseguridad. Yo tengo un sueño para la salud. Y yo tengo un sueño con el desarrollo, el bienestar y la prosperidad de los dajaboneros y dajaboneras. Que quede en el día de hoy para la historia que este humilde dajabonero que se llama Salvador Holguín está con ustedes, seguirá con ustedes y trabaja con ustedes junto a las autoridades de esta provincia de Dajabón.
Llevamos el carnaval por dentro y por fuera. Diablos, robalagallinas, califé, tiznaos, papeluces, llenan las calles de colores y la alegría de que siempre hay nuevos motivos para celebrar. El orgullo dominicano se pega. Lo dominicano se pega y este 27 de febrero se lo vamos a demostrar a todos. Gran festival musical en la Avenida del Puerto. Disfrútalo gratis y a celebrar el mes de la patria con La Coco Band, Chiquito Timbán, La Insuperable, Luis Miguel de la Margue, Alajazá, Fernandito Villalona, Mili Quesada y un espectáculo de fuegos artificiales con música sincronizada. Gran festival musical en la Avenida del Puerto. Este 27 de febrero desde las 6 de la tarde. Invita Gobierno de la República Dominicana.
Hoy sé que no pido ni un rayo de sol para verte. No las tengo todas conmigo. Me deslumbras, me hipnotizas. De repente renaces despierto, no pido nada. Hoy sé que te quiero.
Donde sea que haya un dominicano, ahí estaremos con él, porque somos Banreservas, el banco de todos los dominicanos.
Para cortar el plátano, gire el plátano 45 grados. Con precaución, haga una incisión en la cara de...
No. La verdad que a la gente le gusta complicarse. Lo mismo pasa con el banco. Mira, tú tienes cuchumil cajero, canales para ti 24/7, subagentes, hasta el colmado de enfrente. ¡Colmado! Una app que ni siquiera el internet te consume. Y aún así, hay gente que se da el viaje para el banco. Oye, no hay que complicarse, que los canales Banreservas están ahí para ti, cuando quieras.
No te compliques y utiliza los canales Banreservas, tu banco fuera del banco. Banreservas, el banco de todos los dominicanos.
Is doing well, and the government tends to be reelected. If there is a downfall in the economy, most likely the opposition will come into power. But that used to be on the local terms. Now it's globally. No? Global economic trends define political electoral cycles in Latin America. So when the Democratic left, I should call it, is not the armed left. It's not a revolution. They came elected by the people, no? This Democratic left or center left in Latin America came into office due to the recession that began to take place in 2001. That's what explains that Lula won the elections in 2002 and all the others, because there was an economic situation that was having a negative impact. There was rising prices in foods specifically, unemployment, a lot of marginalized people in the urban areas. So that enabled Democratic left parties to come into power. Now they were lucky enough that once in office, China began growing at 12% average annually, something extraordinary. And China began demanding natural resources that we have in the region, oil, natural gas, copper, soybeans, etc. So China was buying all of these products. And so for the first time, these governments, especially in South America, were having enough resources that they can invest in social policies. So they were investing more in education, investing more in healthcare. And so people were, I would say, supporting massively these governments. They got reelected many times. They had an enormous popularity, right? And it took a whole decade, from 2003 to 2013. And they called this the golden decade economically in Latin America. But beginning in 2014, it was the other way around. So China began lowering its economic growth. There was less demand of commodities coming from Latin America. And from 2014 to 2019, the year before the pandemic, there was a downfall in Latin America's economy. It only grew 0.5. While in the previous decade, from 2003 to 2013, it grew 5.5%, then a downfall to 0.5%. And so those governments that came into office, or that were in office, they lost the upcoming elections. So in the last 14 elections that has taken place in Latin America, from 2014 to 2022, all governments have lost elections. with the exception of Nicaragua, because the president jailed all his opponents.
So every one of them.
Every one of them, right? So he didn't win in a fair way. So this is.
So you think it's cyclical?
It's cyclical. I think politics is like a pendulum. It's like a pendulum in Latin America, more dependent nowadays of global economic trends. In our case, the Dominican Republic, we're more connected to the U.S. We're more connected to the U.S. system. If the economy is doing well in the U.S., then it has a positive impact in the Dominican Republic. For example, what is taking place at this moment? Because of stimulus programs put in place here in the U.S. after the pandemic, consumers are buying more here in the U.S. If you go to shopping malls, you see people buying all the time. If they buy shoes, if they buy clothing, most of this is manufactured in countries like the Dominican Republic. So employment has risen in the Dominican Republic due to U.S. consumption, right? So this is helpful. But at the same time, there is inflation. And if the Federal Reserve increases rates, Dominican Republic has necessarily to increase rates at the same time. Why? Because if the central bank doesn't increase the rates, then there will be a capital flight from the Dominican Republic trying to station where they will get more return. So it's all connected. 92 central banks around the world are doing the same thing, increasing rates, interest rates, right? So there is a connection there. Now, if you raise interest rates to bring down inflation, most likely you're going to slow economic growth. And if you have to continue raising interest rates, at some point there will be a recession. And if there is a recession, whoever is in power will lose the next elections.
Now, of all the countries we talked about, there's three that have remained authoritarian for a long time. One, Cuba, 64 years. Venezuela, a quarter of a century. And Nicaragua, whether you count the first in the 80s, the first period of Ortega, or the recent one, even more. The Dominican Republic, again, has been a model of stability, democracy, free markets. Is there a role for the Dominican Republic to play in perhaps bringing these countries on the democratic side? Well, and if so, what should that be?
I think we began playing that role during my administration when there was a crisis between Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador. Colombian troops entered Ecuadorian soil, persecuting members of the militia groups, members of the guerrilla groups. Colombian guerrilla groups supposedly operating from Ecuador. So we had a meeting by what is called then the Summit of Rio de Janeiro in the Dominican Republic, and there was a quarrel between these three countries. Even they were going to file a lawsuit in The Hague, no, for violation of human rights and whatever. So we were able to solve that problem in a diplomatic way. And so we left the meeting with the idea that the Dominican Republic could play a role of mediating on conflicts within countries in the region. I remember the president from Honduras saying Santo Domingo is the capital of peace in Latin America. And then some other conflicts came about and we were able to solve that, especially Honduras. When there was a military coup against President Zelaya, I had to go and travel, being president of the Dominican Republic, to rescue Zelaya, who was in exile in the Brazilian embassy, but under threat that would be killed by the Honduran military. And so we were playing the role of mediating conflicts in the region, but successive governments have not, been up to the occasion, and I think we have abandoned the idea of being neutral in order to solve problems within the region that no one else could solve, because there's, in some cases, lack of trust on OAS, the Organization of American States. They don't trust what takes place there. They say it is influenced by the US and Canada. They want to have something more Latin American. And there is no resource, there's no, I would say, third party on which you can rely to solve these conflicts that come about now and then among
and so going forward, what do you think the Dominican Republic can do to bring democracy to these three countries in particular?
Well, we can only show our example. The Dominican Republic has progressed, that we have modernized our country with democratic political stability, and that's the only way that can be done. And I think people are beginning to understand that. Because I would say this, Carlos, right from the Declaration of Independence of our countries at the beginning of the 19th century, the goal always was to establish democratic regimes. But we were never able to. The 19th century was always a struggle between caudillismos in different places. We never were able to, with some exceptions. Then entering the 20th century was the Mexican Revolution. I think made an impact in terms of eliminating dictatorship of the time, Porfirio Diaz, and having a democracy with its flaws, because a one-party democracy for many years. Now, Mexico has different political parties. It's a plural party political system. Well, you have Mexico. And then some of Chile at some point up to Allende, when then there was a coup, and then you had Pinochet for many years, and now Chile once again is within the democratic, circle. At some point you have a democratic Christian president, another time you have a socialist president. Now we have a young, very young socialist president, but he has to operate within the framework and the limits of a democratic constitution. So it's important to have the rule of law, and everybody has to respect that rule of law. Otherwise, absolutely, he creates a condition to be ousted from government, as usually has happened in Peru. When the president came out, he said he was going to dissolve the Congress. He couldn't step out of the door.
Right.
I think it was a self-inflicted coup that took place in that occasion. So with Cuba, we have to perhaps understand the historical moment. Cuba really was never democratic. Cuba was the last country to achieve independence at the end of the 19th century, 1898. And Cubans felt that they were mediated by the U.S., that the U.S. played a very active intervening role in Cuba, and so Cubans never understood there was really a democracy there. Juan Bosch, my mentor, lived in Cuba for over 25 years as an exile, and he was a consultant to President Carlos Prío Socarrás, the only democratic president prior to the revolution in 1959. So the revolution in Cuba took place in a moment where there were many other dictatorships in the region, and there was no democratic path to overcome those regimes. So Fidel Castro led the revolution in Cuba in 1959. Some Dominicans participated in that revolution with Fidel Castro. The revolution in Cuba triumphed in January 1959, and we had an expedition, a military expedition, coming out of Cuba in June 1959, 6 months later, with people that were trained and participated in the guerrilla with Fidel Castro coming to the Dominican Republic to overthrow Trujillo, the 14th of June movement. So at the time, when the Cuban Revolution took place, the idea was there's no other way, because the democratic path has been obstructed. We have to do it by revolution. And so Fidel was seen as a hero in Latin America at the time. When Juan Bosch was overthrown by a coup d'etat, and then there was a popular uprising in 1965, and U.S. military took over, people of my generation that began participating in politics, they thought that the only way out was going to be through a revolution. So the revolutionary phenomenon is something that must be understood in the context of the historical process at the time. Now, once you are able to get into power through the democratic system, revolution doesn't make sense. So revolution has become something obsolete. The revolution that's taking place nowadays in the 21st century is the revolution of knowledge, science, and technology. And that's the only way that we can also move forward in Latin America, through knowledge, through science, through technology transfer, so that we can increase our productivity, our competitiveness in international trade, and create a volume of wealth that, well distributed, will make our countries modern countries in Latin America and around the world.
You mentioned China very briefly. Some would argue that the United States for a long time has ignored Latin America, and that by creating a vacuum, the Chinese have been able to step in. And right now, they are South America's biggest investor, biggest trading partner, and the second for Latin America. Were it not for Mexico, where U.S. trade is key, it would be the biggest in Latin America. Are you concerned about the Chinese in Latin America, A, and B, if so, what should U.S. foreign policy look like so that the U.S. has a bigger, stronger, more robust presence in the region?
I think the U.S. was more concerned and involved in Latin America because of the Cuban Revolution. And then you have President Kennedy talk about the Alliance for Progress. It was a response to the Cuban Revolution. But then in the 1980s, as the dictatorships gave way to democratic governments, I think there was a neglect from the U.S. Policymakers in terms of the importance Latin America had for foreign affairs, for the U.S. foreign affairs. I think there was some sort of neglect in understanding the importance of Latin America. Now, the Chinese began coming into the region more the 90s and the beginning of this century, especially in South America. And I would say this neglect or indifference came more from the economic side. U.S. multinationals began abandoning Latin America. They thought that Latin American countries were too small, not enough population to buy goods and services from the U.S. U.S. companies, on the other hand, began going to China, investing in China, right? The industrial belt up in Northeast, I know that because we have many Dominicans living, for example, in Providence and Lawrence. This used to be manufacturing places, no? Ghost cities nowadays. Those companies went to China. And they went to China because they saw China had a huge population, 1.4 billion, so they're going to be consumers, they're going to buy American products manufactured in China. Dominican Republic only has 11 million people, not enough population to buy goods and services for America. So all these companies left, or the majority of these companies left. You don't find one U.S. company doing infrastructure development in Latin America. I don't know of anyone. And so Chinese companies began overtaking U.S. market in South America, not in the Caribbean. In the Caribbean, U.S. always had a tighter connection, and it's just been recently because Taiwan was unable to really deliver in terms of connecting the Latin American countries with investments coming from Taiwan. Taiwan was also investing in China. Taiwanese companies were going to China. So the Taiwanese government was interested in having a relationship with our government, but the Taiwanese private sector made no investments. They were still aiding. Yeah, we'll give you ambulances, or we'll build a hospital for you. Well, we have become middle-class income countries. We don't need this type of aid anymore. We want investments. So the Taiwanese or the U.S. companies were not investing. The Chinese come in, they say, we're going to build this for you, we're going to do the other thing, and so they become attractive. I think the U.S. has reacted lately, I would say, to the penetration of China in this part of the world, but still early enough. Still, I think the U.S. has a geopolitical interest in increasing its support in this part of the region, because we all see that the rivalry in the 21st century is between U.S. and China. And we are in, I would say, in the geopolitical sphere of U.S. interest. And so the U.S. cannot ignore this part of the world anymore, because you can install naval bases, you can have terrorist groups operating, for example, in this part of the world. And I would say, for example, Haiti. I think the U.S. is not paying enough attention to Haiti. Haiti is very close to U.S. soil. You can have terrorist groups operating there. You can have all kinds of things that would damage U.S. Homeland interests. So you have to pay attention to these things. You know, it's not only that Dominican Republic cares because it's our closest neighbor, and we might have a massive illegal migration coming into our country, but it's because Haitians are migrating also illegally into the U.S. They're being returned when they reach the Keys, but many things can happen. So for geopolitical interests, I think the U.S. has to pay more attention to this part of the world. We need more investment, and we know that there's a new program called nearshoring. And with nearshoring, I think we're going to surpass the impact of the free trade zones, because I think we can bring the global chain system. With the global chain system, for example, Dominican Republic is not in the automotive industry, but we can be part of the automotive industry. Whatever components can be manufactured and be part of the chain, we can go into the aerospace, whatever. We can leapfrog into different products and services with more value added, which is the challenge that we have for the future.
So speaking of those challenges, we mentioned before you've been president for 3 terms. You're eligible for 2 more terms.
Yes.
If you were to run again and win, what would a Fernandez 4 administration look different from the previous 3?
Well, there is continuity and change, as everything. No? Continuity in terms that we're going to continue consolidating democratic institutions in the Dominican Republic. That's one. The rule of law. So there can be no way back. Whoever governs in the future, you have to maintain a democratic system. Right. We can improve that, We can make it more participatory so that citizens not only have a passive participation, they can actively participate in policy making, designing different policies for education, for healthcare, for agriculture, industry, whatever. That can be done, but I think one basic thing is guaranteeing permanent, sustainable, democratic stability in the Dominican Republic. From the economic side, we have evolved, as I said before, from agricultural exports more into a service economy. I think our next step would be to scale up into a high-tech economy, more technologically driven, so we can implement technology to every sector, to agriculture, to industry, to the service sector, so we will have more productivity gains. But at the same time, how can we get into the world economy, especially here in the United States, with more goods and services with value added? One major element where FIU will help us govern well for the Dominican Republic is we're going to work on something called a strategic alliance between Florida and the Dominican Republic. We see that Dominican Republic should be the next Florida in the Caribbean, have the modernization, have a university like FIU in some of our provinces back in the Dominican Republic. And I know we can do that because the president of the Student Association is a Dominican. Christopher is here. So, and Christopher, who surprised me, I just met him when I came in.
PhD student?
Is a PhD student in computer science, what we need in the Dominican Republic to make a real change. So Christopher will be a role model for Dominicans in the Dominican Republic because we want to get into the computer science, in biotech, in nanotech, in the software development, anything that has to do with a high-tech ecosystem that will transform the Dominican Republic. So you're in charge of that, Christopher, right from now.
In a few minutes, we're going to start getting ready for student questions, so start thinking of your questions. A couple of concluding questions. You've been a public servant for a long time. What's your biggest regret and the thing you're the most proud of as a public servant?
Well, you know, there's always a learning curve. I remember when I came in, people were protesting in front of the palace because they wanted a decree that was delivered by my predecessor to be changed. And then I say, what is it that they want? They were expelled from the places they were living near a river, and they want to get back to that place. And I said, can we do that? I said, you can do it temporarily until we build new houses for them. In the meantime, they don't have to be homeless. I said, it sounds like a good idea. But then instead of just annulling the previous decree and delivering a new one, I invited those people to come into the palace, to the cabinet room. So they will feel that it was a new democratic government that was with the people. And so, yes, we were able to arrange them back again where they were until we finally built the homes they went into. But then when other groups saw that the new president was inviting people to come into the palace, strikes and protests began taking place every day. So I think I was paying the price for being a rookie president. Right? I regret that. Also, I would say salaries were very low at the time when I got into salaries for public servants. So I began taking the pressure to increase those salaries. And I made the mistake to do it before the end of the budget, the fiscal year. And people said that wasn't fair, that was governing for the elites and not for the people. And so I regret that, but it was a lack of knowledge, it was a lack of experience. And so we were able to solve that.
Your biggest accomplishment?
Biggest accomplishment?
If you have to choose one.
I would say when I inaugurated the Santo Domingo Cyber Park, because I saw that as the way for the future. That dream has not been fully fulfilled, but I think with the Technological Institute of the Americas and the Cyber Park is converting that into a technological corridor of the Americas that we will do in our partnership with the state of Florida.
The metro.
Ah, the metro.
The metro.
Yes. Well, thank you for remembering that. Yes. When we built the metro system, is a subway system in the Dominican Republic. Nobody thought we could do it. They said this is something for developed countries, not for countries like the Dominican Republic. And we did it with Dominican engineers. They built the subway. When we inaugurated the subway, the metro, it was a day of pride for Dominican Republic. We saw the flags everywhere, and even in New York, people in their apartments were hanging the Dominican flag in sense of pride that we were able to build a subway system in the country. Thank you for remembering that to me.
At the center, we're developing a leadership program to study leadership in collaboration with the College of Business, and we have a scholar of leadership here.
Convencidos en que la tecnología e información son garantías de éxito y desarrollo de las personas en la era digital, la Fundación Salvador Holguín trae totalmente gratis a tu provincia de Jabón los cursos de informática e inglés para ponerte acorde con los tiempos y garantizar la capacitación y profesionalidad de sus compueblanos. Ya están abiertas las inscripciones. Llama ahora mismo al 849-457-4226. Fundación Salvador Holguín. Tecnología a tu alcance.
Para cortar el plátano, gire el plátano 45 grados. Con precaución, haga una incisión en la cara de...
No. La verdad que a la gente le gusta complicarse. Lo mismo pasa con el banco. Mira, tú tienes cuchumil cajero, canales para ti 24/7, subagentes, hasta el colmado de enfrente.
¡Colmado!
Una app que ni siquiera el internet te consume. Y aún así, hay gente que se da el viaje para el banco. Oye, no hay que complicarse, que los canales Banreservas están ahí para ti, cuando quieras.
No te compliques y utiliza los canales Banreservas, tu banco fuera del banco. Banreservas, el banco de todos los dominicanos.
Tenemos un propósito que marcará un antes y un después en la historia de la República Dominicana. Despachar la mercancía que llega a nuestros puertos en 24 horas. Es un trabajo en equipo, un desafío que solo se puede enfrentar con entusiasmo y valentía. Nuestras aduanas están equipándose con los últimos avances tecnológicos porque solo con modernidad y eficiencia podremos agilizar los procesos operativos. Es un gran reto, pero si unimos nuestras voluntades, juntos podremos lograrlo.
Esta iniciativa impactará los índices de competitividad de nuestro país, favorecerá el comercio exterior y mejorará la calidad de vida de nuestra gente. Nos encaminamos a ser el hub logístico de la región. Es un propósito donde ganamos todos, pero sobre todo ganamos como país.
Despacho en 24 horas. Juntos a tiempo. Dirección General de Aduanas.
Papá, yo estoy harto ya. Yo lo que quiero es que quiten el toque de queda. Poder salir a la calle a cualquier hora, janguear, comerme un chimi.
Este es Kelvin, el único que falta por vacunarse en el barrio.
Llegarle a todos los coros, ya está bueno.
Ajá, todos estamos cansados.
Que quiten el toque de queda, depende de nosotros.
Si no nos vacunamos, no lo van a quitar.
Porque nos jodemos.
Bueno, vacúnense ustedes porque yo no. Sube la música ahí.
Interrumpimos este programa para anunciar que tendremos que seguir con el toque de queda, porque falta una sola persona por vacunarse.
En verdad lo que yo estaba diciendo es que yo me voy a ir a vacunar.
Ok, dale.
Ayuda al país a abrir negocios, empleos, abrazos, libertad. Vacúnate, refuérzate, ya. Lo dominicano se pega y este 27 de febrero se lo vamos a demostrar a todos. Gran festival musical en la Avenida del Puerto. Disfrútalo gratis y a celebrar el mes de la patria con La Coco Band, Chiquito Timbán, La Insuperable, Luis Miguel de la Margue, Alajazá, Fernandito Villalona, Mili Quesada y un espectáculo de fuegos artificiales con música sincronizada. Gran festival musical en la Avenida del Puerto. Este 27 de febrero desde las 6 de la tarde. Invita Gobierno de la República Dominicana. Llevamos el carnaval por dentro y por fuera. Diablos, robalagallinas, califé, tiznaos, papeluces, llenan las calles de colores y la alegría de que siempre hay nuevos motivos para celebrar. El orgullo dominicano se pega.
Y yo quiero decirle a los dajaboneros y dajaboneras en el día de hoy que Salvador Holguín tiene un sueño para con su pueblo. Que Salvador Holguín tiene aspiraciones para con su gente. Que Salvador Holguín está trabajando día y noche para acompañarles a ustedes junto a las autoridades del gobierno del presidente Luis Abinader para traerles soluciones a esta importante provincia que me vio nacer. Yo tengo un sueño para con Dajabón y estoy trabajando para cumplirlo. Yo tengo un sueño de desarrollo. Yo tengo un sueño de bienestar. Yo tengo un sueño de oportunidades para los jóvenes. Yo tengo un sueño para detener la haitianización que existe en esta frontera. Yo tengo un sueño para evitar la inseguridad. Yo tengo un sueño para la salud. Y yo tengo un sueño con el desarrollo, el bienestar y la prosperidad de los dajaboneros y dajaboneras. Que quede en el día de hoy para la historia que este humilde dajabonero que se llama Salvador Holguín está con ustedes, seguirá con ustedes y trabaja con ustedes junto a las autoridades de esta provincia de Dajabón.
Para cortar el plátano, gire el plátano 45 grados. Con precaución, haga una incisión en la cara de...
No. La verdad que a la gente le gusta complicarse. Lo mismo pasa con el banco. Mira, tú tienes cuchumil cajero, canales para ti 24/7, subagentes, hasta el colmado de enfrente.
¡Colmado!
Una app que ni siquiera el internet te consume. Y aún así, hay gente que se da el viaje para el banco. Oye, no hay que complicarse, que los canales Banreservas están ahí para ti, cuando quieras.
No te compliques y utiliza los canales Banreservas, tu banco fuera del banco. Banreservas, el banco de todos los dominicanos.
Hoy sé que no pido ni un rayo de sol para verte. No las tengo todas conmigo. Me deslumbras, me hipnotizas. De repente renaces despierto, no pido nada. Hoy sé que te quiero.
Donde sea que haya un dominicano, ahí estaremos con él, porque somos Banreservas, el banco de todos los dominicanos.
Aquí, en la provincia de Duarte.
Esto es cambio.
La provincia de Duarte es una provincia maravillosa.
La gente de aquí somos todas trabajadoras, buenas y serviciales.
En otro tiempo, verdaderamente fuimos abandonados.
Realmente era un caos.
Pero después que nuestro presidente Luis Abinader llegó,
nosotros estamos dentro del cambio, de ese cambio que el presidente soñó.
Nos encontramos en la provincia de Duarte, en donde el gobierno central, a través del Ministerio de Obras Públicas, ha venido realizando un conjunto de ejecutorias para mejorar la calidad de vida de los habitantes de esta provincia.
Y se están cumpliendo los trabajos a capa y espada. Antes esto era intransitable.
Porque imagínate, si antes era mucho polvo y un desastre.
Hoy día, esta vía no está en una maqueta, esto es un diseño realizado.
En tiempos atrás solamente había un beneficiario del puente Guisa, que era el río, porque cada vez que hacían un puentecito lo hacían malo y se iba. Esa obra para nosotros ha sido una obra maravillosa. Vimos realidad este sueño.
Y miren, 2 años aquí se ha faltado, a donde quiera.
Ahora podemos salir en los vehículos, llegamos más a tiempo y nuestros vehículos no se deterioran. Y agradecidos estamos como comunitarios por eso.
También tenemos lo que es la reconstrucción, el asfaltado de la carretera de Controva hacia San Francisco, así previendo accidentes y mejorando la seguridad vial de la misma.
Esto que ustedes están viendo hoy aquí es solo una pincelada de lo que está haciendo el gobierno en la provincia de Duarte.
Lo que San Cristóbal necesita se está haciendo.
En menos de 3 años, lo que se prometió se está cumpliendo. Mejoramiento Acueducto San Cristóbal. Proyecto de reparación del Centro Médico del Primer Nivel La Palmita. Instituto Preparatorio de Menores Refor. Fase 2 de Dominicana se reconstruye. Trébol de San Cristóbal. Planta de tratamiento de aguas residuales.
¿Y ahora que falta mambo?
Porque pensamos en todos, empezando por ti. Esto es cambio.
Gobierno de la República Dominicana.
Aquí,
en la provincia de Santiago, esto es cambio.
Imagínate tú, no es fácil.
Nadie nos hacía caso.
Después de tener más de 12 años en la comunidad abandonada,
nuestros barrios que daban pena.
Claro, el cambio se siente desde ya, desde que Luis Abinader tomó las riendas de nuestro país.
Teníamos varios años esperando la terminación del tramo de la circunvalación norte. Es un tramo que nos ayuda a descentralizarnos de la ciudad y en el cual nos da una potencial muy alta, tanto de trabajo, porque ya no es una promesa, es una realidad. Son 77 barrios que se han comunicado directamente. Nos dignifica como personas y aparte que nuestro entorno coge más valor y nuestra propiedad. Nos encontramos en el puente Abraham Gómez. Teníamos un largo tiempo ansiosos por este puente.
Este puente comunica la autopista Duarte con Laguna Prieta, Puñal y Guayabal. Cuenta con todos los elementos estructurales y las especificaciones técnicas que debe contar con un puente metálico.
Desde el 2008 no se le daba un remozamiento a esta arena y estamos más que agradecidos tanto como santiagueros y como presidente de la Asociación de Baloncesto de Santiago.
Los santiagueros estamos orgullosos de esta gestión porque
se siente el calor del gobierno ayudando a su gente.
Esto es cambio.
Los Ríos estamos ejecutando una obra que se llama el saneamiento pluvial y sanitario de la cañada de Arroyo Hondo. Hemos alcanzado ya el sellado de la cañada.
En los 35 años que tengo viviendo aquí, el primer presidente viene aquí a la cañada. Desde que empezaba a llover estaba todo el mundo de pie y con la cama amarrada en soga.
Teníamos una precariedad con esta cañada, eso era insoportable.
Una vez uno a las 12 de la noche tenía que levantarse a ayudar a los vecinos, a meterse al agua porque se inundaba todo.
Llegó el cambio al sector de nosotros los ríos, ya prácticamente eso ya está pasando a la historia.
Ya no le decimos cañada, le decimos la ex cañada.
Nosotros tenemos ya un presidente que se duele por nosotros, que nos ha escuchado.
Mucha diferencia. Ahora cuando llueve uno se siente asombrado porque ni siquiera ve el agua cruzar. Está uno prácticamente en un paraíso.
Se resuelve un problema de salubridad, se resuelve un problema de derramamientos de agua, de crecida de las cañadas. Alcanzar lo que hemos hecho en esta etapa, esto es cambio.
Ya los niños juegan, no tenemos susto de que está lloviendo y vamos a tener que salir corriendo de aquí porque lo estamos disfrutando bastante, nos sentamos en la tarde, nos recreamos.
Ya todos los domingos, los fines de semana lo vamos a compartir todo en familia aquí, ya ustedes saben.
Ponle Ponle tú también pilas nuevas a tu negocio con Expo Fomenta Pymes Banreservas. Aprovecha tasas desde 12.95%, ofertas en comercios aliados, charlas, talleres de educación financiera, premios y mucho más. Expo Fomenta Pymes Banreservas. Hasta el 15 de mayo. Cupo limitado. Más información en banreservas.com. Banreservas, el banco de todos los dominicanos.
Bring that to me.
At the center, we're developing a leadership program to study leadership in collaboration with the College of Business, and we have a scholar of leadership here. In your opinion, briefly, what makes a great leader?
Thinking about the people. It's not about you, it's about the people. So if you have that always focused, that you're working to improve the life of your fellow citizens, and it's a great personal sacrifice, then you might become a good leader. You have to listen. You learn by listening. You have to understand the particular things that really interest people. You have to be a people's man in order to become a leader.
So we began talking about you as a public servant, and I want to conclude with a question that I ask every leader that comes into the center. We have a lot of young students here, tons. And I'm sure many of them want to be public servants one day. But they read the news, they look at what's going on around them, and all they see is the negativity surrounding public service, politicians, the corruption, the scandals. What do you tell them to become, why should they be public servants? What words of advice would you give them if they really want to be public servants, but they're turned off by what they read or see on television?
Well, you know, I would say being a politician, especially in Latin America nowadays, is always serious business, and is perhaps even dangerous because your reputation is always on the line. But there is also a sense of honor serving your country, right? And if you get that honor bestowed upon you, and you can really make a contribution and be able to transform the country, I mean, there's no more honor than that you can get. On a personal level, if you're someone who is seeking knowledge and experience, there's no other place that you can gain more knowledge than being a public servant. Because politics has to do with everything. If you become a medical doctor, you only know about medicine, and you only know about your area of expertise. If you become a lawyer, you stick with civil law, or you're a trial lawyer, but you don't know much more about that. But in politics, you know about everything. You know about healthcare, you learn about education, you learn about agriculture, you learn about just about, so your interest for life opens up for you. It enlightens you to really, you understand the world better, you understand human nature better. So nothing is more transformative than becoming a public servant on the personal level.
So if you're looking back and look at a young Leonel, the high school student, and you have a choice of being a baseball player, Hall of Famer, or president, you would have chosen the same? I would have
preferred being a baseball player. I'm still stuck to it. I'm still stuck to it.
All right. So let's open it up for questions. I'll ask if we can have the students go first. So, yes, right here. Yes.
Okay. So, hello, everyone.
Say your name and where you're from.
I'm Zalo Batista, born and raised in the Dominican Republic. Moved here almost 3 years ago to pursue my bachelor's here in finance and economics. Mr. President, the pleasure to have you. Basically, I just wanted to ask you because I had the chance to be an intern in the Ministry of Finance this last summer, and I will be heading to JP Morgan as soon as I graduate to be in the investment banking division. And we're low-key heading into a recession, so I just wanted to know what measures and actions would you want to take if and when you get elected and you basically become president for the stability of the banking system, especially in the Latin America industry.
So for the next questions, we're going to have a microphone only for the benefit of people watching online.
Right. Well, let me tell you, we have a very financial stable system in the Dominican Republic, as you well know. The last banking failures took place 2003, and ever since, many measures were taken and implemented to have a trustworthy and stable financial system. Now, you never know. Look what's happening here now. There recent failure by 2 banks, and there's a lot of concern that it might spread and affect other banks here in the States or even in Europe. So we hope it doesn't happen, because it's always a catastrophe when you have these financial fall downs. But I think with your experience, what you're doing here, and what you're planning to do at JP Morgan will be of great interest for the Dominican Republic, because we are connected to the financial international system. We're always issuing bonds, we're increasing our debt, and if we have Dominicans who are knowledgeable about how the global financial system operates, you can better represent the interests of the Dominican Republic. So I congratulate you. So we have in computer science and now in finance, I think the Dominican Republic is heading for a very prosperous 21st century. Okay, Christopher?
Yes.
Okay.
Go here. The microphone right behind you.
Hello, my name is Ishmael, and I was born in the Dominican Republic. My major is political science, indeed. My question is, in 1995 and 1996, when you were working with President Balaguer and former President Bush, how did it come for you to be the candidate for the 1996 election? How that happened? And also, the next question will be, in 2018, when the Dominican Republic withdrew the recognition of Taiwan, the Republic of China, for the People's Republic of China, you were already an influential figure within the government. How did you react? What was your opinion on that decision?
Okay.
Great questions.
Before I answer the question, I would like to acknowledge the presence of two senators from the Dominican Republic that are with us at the audience. Dos senadores de República Dominicana, Diony Sánchez, who is the speaker, and Franklin Rodriguez. They happen to be also members of our party, La Fuerza del Pueblo. All right? Going to your question, I've never held any public office. I was never a councilman nor a representative or senator as they are. I just came up to the ranks, no? In 1993, I was elected vice presidential candidate with Juan Bosch. And since he was already ailing a little bit, he was suffering from Alzheimer, he wasn't able to really campaign. So I campaigned for him in places that he couldn't go anymore. And so I learned, listening to the people, I learned about what I said before, the very peculiar things that interest people. So if I went, for example, to San Francisco de Macorís, that you know well, what is their interest? Rice production. So people would explain to me about rice, and I would learn a lot about rice production. If I go to the border with Haiti, Montecristi, people export bananas. So they will explain to me what they would be expecting from a new government about banana exports. So you would learn about banana exports just listening to the people there. And that's how it happened. So we had a crisis. The only real crisis, no, we had one in 1992, an electoral crisis, again in 1994. And the next period was lowered to 2 years. So instead of being from 1994 to 1998, it became 94 and 96. And that's how I came in as a candidate in 1996. But it was because I was a vice presidential candidate the year before. My relationship was really with Juan Bosch. He was my professor, I would say. No? In the Dominican Republic, one learns more informally than formally. Here you have the chance to come to a university and you learn the formal way. We learn by doing. We learn in practice. We learn in real life. And I would say being in politics taught me a lot. For example, I became a journalist, but because the party, our political party, had a newspaper. And I would write every week. I would write about economics, I would write about international affairs, but it was never scholarly. It was something that was done, every week. Reading, of course, magazines, newspapers, books, whatever, and coaching you someone who was a professional writer. So he would take his red pen and say, you don't write like this, you have to be more specific, don't use adjectives, you always go directly to what you want to say. So you learn, you're trained in practice, and then you see the effect your writing has on people. You say, oh, I read your article, I find it very interesting, I learned a lot from what you said. That's the way we learned, that's the way it was happening. So with Balaguer, And my impression of him, as I said before, even though he has a long history that came within the Trujillo regime, and my generation objected him because of that, they always thought, why a man of such brilliance and of such but I think he has been a positive force. At the end, I think history will judge him as a positive force for change in the Dominican Republic. So that's the way it happened. I never thought I would be a presidential candidate. I never aspired to that. I was participating in politics because I could not be indifferent with what was taking place in the country. But by participating, you become noticeable. People start looking at your leadership. You get involved, and that's what happens. I have a friend here, Joaquin Jerónimo, who was my classmate back from ninth grade. And he also began participating with politics with me personally. He became ambassador. He was ambassador during my period, my government. And now we are in this new political party, Fuerza del Pueblo.
Mm-hmm. Right? And Taiwan?
Taiwan. Repeat the question again on Taiwan.
Of course. In 2018, the government, you were already, you were not the president, but you were influential. You were an influential figure in politics and government. How was your reaction with the change of recognition from Taiwan to the
China?
Of China?
Look, I think it was inevitable that would happen because China has control. And then when Dominican Republic wanted, for example, to lead one of the agencies, we didn't have China's support. But China was and is very influential in Africa. So all those African votes, we will not have it. China is very influential with countries in Asia. So Dominican Republic was alienated in the UN system. We couldn't really hold any position because China will alienate the votes for any country that did not have formal diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China. So Taiwan's influence was waning and China's influence was continuously moving up. So it was inevitable that at some point we needed to have formal diplomatic relations with the second most important and powerful country in the world.
Sure. Yeah. You can start it.
I could project.
Yeah, start it. Project.
First of all, good evening, everyone. First of all, thank you so much for coming out here and taking time out your very busy schedule to meet with us, all Florida International University students. We thank you so much. So as you can see, there's a number of Dominican students studying here in the United States. So what measures do you think could be implemented to support and encourage those Dominican students studying here in the USA? And how can Dominican Republic further benefit from the education and the skills these students bring back home?
Right. Well, first of all, I think you're all very privileged to be here in the States at the college level because you become bilingual, you become bicultural, you create a network of relationships that is, I would say, human capital, social capital that would be of great interest for the Dominican Republic. Now, our main challenge is how can we bring you back? Because once you are at FIU, we have nothing of this nature back in the Dominican Republic. So how can we attract you? We have to create opportunities. And by that I mean, for example, in your case, the technological corridor, the America's technological corridor. If you find high-tech corporations in the DR, computer science, you will be willing to come back. Now, you won't stay because you will never stay definitely. You will be going back and forth. If you've lived here, you don't go back and stay there. There's so many things taking place here in the States that you need to come back now and then, right? So you become circular. You're there, you're here, you're everywhere. You become global. And we need global citizens in the Dominican Republic. If you go to JP Morgan, you know what that means for the Dominican Republic? The value added that you're having for your country? Fantastic, excellent. You cannot stay forever here. We need you down there, but you're not going to stay there either. You're going to be around, here and there, but making connections, attracting investors to the Dominican Republic, making of the Dominican Republic a showcase for the world. And that's what you can do. And that's we are aspiring to create that atmosphere for our youth to be part of the transformative process in the Dominican Republic.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, let's have time for 2 more questions. We'll do, well, we got 3 hands, so let's do, yikes. Okay, we'll do 1 and 2. Let's see. Go ahead. Then we have to leave. He has a plane to catch.
Yeah, okay.
So make it brief. And name and where you're from.
Good afternoon. My name is Lizzie. I graduated from civil engineering last December, and I'm from the Dominican Republic as well.
Civil engineering, okay.
And I would like to know, what do you recommend us as a new generation to keep making improvements and to help and serve our country, not necessarily as politicians, but as global citizens?
Right.
Great question.
Well, I think for you, civil engineer here in the States, Dominican Republic is booming in terms of real estate. As a matter of fact, we have an engineer here. His name is Jose Espinal. Jose Espinal is a new generation of engineers in the Dominican Republic from Santiago, the 2nd largest city in the country. And he's part of a movement that is transforming Santiago with new architectural styles. It's glass and steel. You go into Santiago, you see it's a modern city. Little Miami is Santiago because of what they're doing, right? So in your case, I would say stay in touch with colleagues from the Dominican Republic, civil engineers, what they're doing down there. He would like to also bring his colleagues here and invest in Miami, invest in Florida, in real estate. Because if we're talking about integrating Dominican Republic into Florida, integration means many things. It means investments, it means trade, it means finance, it means science, it means education. So if we can bring investors from the DR to invest in Florida, they will accumulate a larger volume of wealth, but at the same time they will learn with the new techniques that are being implemented here. And they will take that back to the Dominican Republic, and we create a bridge between Florida and the Dominican Republic for mutual benefit. It will benefit people living in Florida, it will benefit people living in the Dominican Republic. This is what I think is the wave of the future, building that bridge that can connect us together in the different endeavors in which we're involved, right? In your particular case, young Dominican, professional, living here, you have to read Dominican history. You have to somehow strengthen your national identity. You're global, but you're Dominican. Right? Your Dominican roots has to be strengthened and deepened every time, and that means getting emotionally connected with what takes place in the Dominican Republic.
All right, go for it.
Good afternoon, Señor Presidente. My name is Sam Picardo, and I study international relations here at FIU. My family's originally from Venezuela. On the topic of building bridges, my question is the Dominican Republic making the same calculation that they don't want to be stuck in sort of the competition between economically and politically between China and the US, and want to keep fostering those regional relationships between, for example, Mercosur and the Dominican Republic, or the Dominican Republic and the EU, especially in light of, for example, Mercosur is about to, or they already signed a trade agreement with the EU, which they've been working on for, I think, decades now. So do you see yourself fostering those more regional relationships and alternative bridges?
Well, you have to have I would say, strategy for your country. And any country would try to diversify its international relations. So you'll have a presence everywhere, in Europe, in Latin America, in the US, in Asia, everywhere. Now, our main partner is the US for logical reasons. First of all, we have 2 million Dominicans living here already. Look at you, you're Dominican Americans, right? You have American culture, you have the English language, so you are naturally, it comes out naturally because of demographics, Dominicans living in the States, 300,000 already in Florida. 300,000 Dominicans in Florida already. I mean, if you don't take care enough, there will be a legal massive overtaken by the Dominican Republic here in Florida. Right? Peaceful overtake. But what I mean is, you have to diversify. You need to have diplomatic relations with just about anyone in the world. You don't need to have 194 embassies around the world because, you know, a country like ours doesn't need to have an embassy in Nigeria because we hardly have anything in Nigeria. But we do have an embassy, for example, in South Africa. We have an embassy in Morocco, in the northern part of Africa. Of course, an embassy in Spain, in France, in the UK, all these countries, we have an embassy. We diversify, but our main partner is the US for demographics and for geographical proximity. We're 1 hour, 45 minutes away from Florida. We're right there. You can see Dominican presence at the Marlins ballpark on Saturday. It was Dominican Republic there. Dominican flag was there. I mean, we feel in Florida like it's an extension of the Dominican Republic. So diversify, but you have partners. US is our main partner. Haiti is our main challenge. One island, two countries. One has progressed. The other is in decline. So it's also very important for our international relations.
So Florida has the third largest Dominican community
the third.
In the United States.
It's New York, New Jersey, and Florida.
Yeah. All right, we have time for one concluding question. One of you two, you choose. There we go. Thank you.
Hi, I'm an electrical engineering student here in FIU. I'm Dominican. I was born here, but I grew up a lot in DR. And so a question that I often think about is power issues in the Dominican Republic, you know? Like when I'm in La Capital or when I'm in San Francisco, because that's where I'm from, there's never really stable power, you know? Is that something that the government can take care of? Is that something that the government tries to take care of? Is it something that can be taken care of? And as an electrical engineer, is there something that I can do maybe in the future?
Right, excellent. So a Dominican electrical engineering, cero apagones.
Campaign slogan, huh?
Campaign slogan, cero apagones. We have to deliver then.
There we go.
Yes, I would say this. We have made a lot of improvement in terms of electric power in the Dominican Republic, even though some people do not appreciate it because we still have blackouts. But we have increased our generating power enormously. Transmission lines. Our problem has to do with distribution. And distribution creates more a social problem. We have many people that are incapable of paying the bills. When you're out of the capital city or the urban areas, people live in the countryside, they don't have the means to pay the electric bills. And so that creates an economic problem for the country. So we say we have financial blackouts more than electrical blackouts nowadays. We're moving more into renewables, more solar, more wind, and more hydraulic in order to lower the price of electric generation and create a situation where there will be no more blackouts in the DR. But also blackouts occur because the economy is growing, new buildings are being constructed, there's new demand, and so our capacity to generate goes behind the need for new demand, satisfy the new demand. So if the country is modernizing, the country is improving, moving forward, you need to generate more electricity than we had before. And that generates the need for higher and bigger investments. And but the technical electrical knowledge will be tremendously of great importance in the DR. So we expect you also to be there. Right? Congratulations for your degree in engineering electricity, right? And in his case, born in the U.S. of Dominican parents. And now we have more Dominicans that were born here than those that came by migration. So you're a case that can prove the point.
Mr. President, thank you so much. This has been a tremendous treat. We could be here a few more hours, but you have a plane to catch. You've been very generous with your time. Thank you all for coming, and thank you again for being here with us. It's been a pleasure. Presidente, gracias.
dice la gente que me quiere mucho, el primer poeta ciego de América. Con la pandemia, yo me vi imposibilitado de salir a proyectar mis obras. Teníamos problemas de ser inclusive sacados del apartamento donde vivíamos. Y decidimos escribirle al presidente. Fuimos favorecidos con un apartamento acá, gracias a la generosidad del señor presidente y del Ministerio de la Vivienda. Esa noticia nos hizo interpretar, llenos de alegría, el himno de Violeta Parra, Gracias a la Vida. El país ha experimentado un cambio muy positivo. Mi vida cambió de oscuro a blanco.
La pandemia fue algo muy monstruoso. Estábamos en la casa y
no llegaba el sustento, no había podido donde trabajar ni nada.
Todo el mundo estaba un poco asustado porque no esperábamos esta pandemia.
Uno no podía salir a trabajar, esperando que lo que llegara uno desenvolverse con eso.
Mi proceso fue por vía de Supérate. Ellos nos llamaron, me inscribí, me gustó el proyecto y acepté.
Fue una cosa rápida porque no teníamos experiencia en esto.
Yo creo que mi vida va a cambiar para superarme.
Mi vida ha cambiado totalmente porque ya yo no tengo el temor de que no voy a llevar el sustento de mis hijos a mi casa.
Está cambiando mi vida.
Papá, yo estoy harto ya. Yo lo que quiero es que quiten el toque de queda. Poder salir a la calle a cualquier hora, janguear, comerme un chimi.
Este es Kelvin, el único que falta por vacunarse en el barrio.
Llegarle a todos los coros, ya está bueno.
Ajá, todos estamos cansados.
Que quiten el toque de queda depende de nosotros.
Si no nos vacunamos, no lo van a quitar.
Porque nos jodemos.
Bueno, vacúnense ustedes porque yo no. ¡Sube la música ahí!
Interrumpimos este programa para anunciar que tendremos que seguir con el toque de queda, porque falta una sola persona por vacunarse.
En verdad lo que yo estaba diciendo es que yo me voy a ir a vacunar.
Ok, dale. Ayuda al país a abrir negocios, empleos, abrazos, libertad. Vacúnate, refuérzate, ya.
Convencidos en que la tecnología e información son garantías de éxito y desarrollo de las personas en la era digital, la Fundación Salvador Holguín trae totalmente gratis a tu provincia de Jabón los cursos de informática e inglés para ponerte acorde con los tiempos y garantizar la capacitación y profesionalidad de sus compueblanos. Ya están abiertas las inscripciones. Llama ahora mismo al 849-457-4226. Fundación Salvador Holguín. Tecnología a tu alcance.
Aquí no se corta nada. La democracia no perecerá. La libertad de expresión es garantizada. En la República Dominicana y el mundo siguen el periódico Sin Cortapisa. Sin Cortapisa. Las noticias como son.
Para cortar el plátano, gire el plátano 45 grados. Con precaución, haga una incisión en la cara de...
No. La verdad que a la gente le gusta complicarse. Lo mismo pasa con el banco. Mira, tú tienes cuchumil cajero. Canal es para ti 24/7. Subagentes, hasta el colmado de enfrente.
Colmado.
Una app que ni siquiera el internet te consume. Y aún así, hay gente que se da el viaje para el banco. Oye, no hay que complicarse, que los canales Banreservas están ahí para ti, cuando quieras.
No te compliques y utiliza los canales Banreservas, tu banco fuera del banco. Banreservas, el banco de todos los dominicanos.
Con la brisita navideña vienen los mercados económicos de Inespre, con los productos básicos de la canasta familiar y los ingredientes de la cena navideña a precios justos, para que tengas una Navidad más feliz. Primero tu familia, primero tu alegría, primero tu Navidad.
Gracias a Salvador Higuín ya puedo contar con una ayuda que me dio.
Porque era algo de que yo le estaba pidiendo a Dios desde hace un par de meses, desde que tuve el accidente. Y gracias a Dios primeramente me dio la oportunidad de conocer a Salvador y me dio su mano amiga entre ella y Sam. Gracias al Señor le doy que me lo puso en mi camino.
Bueno, yo venía bajando para arriba y llegando a Rodríguez. Un borracho se me atravesó. Salito y como quiera me traje en una vía contraria ahí. Yo no pensé más nada, no pensé en los muchachos así, cómo se iban a hacer ya para adelante. Me sentí sumamente contento. Como te digo, la operación fue todo un éxito, muy bien. Los médicos dicen que hay médicos perros, mentira. Ahí no hay médicos perros. Muchas gracias a Salvador, muchas gracias a todos el que apoyó granito de arena, gracias aquí a Sandy, a mi esposa, que se murió mucho también, y todo el que estaba en oración respecto a esa operación.
Salvador Higuín, yo le quiero decir que siga así, que el Señor le va a dar su recompensa, y el grupo médico, que lo felicito, porque el primer hospital que voy y tienen esa tendencia fue en Santo Domingo.
Un logro más de lo que se está haciendo en el grupo democrático, liderado por el líder Salvador Higuín. Este es uno más de los logros de lo que nos ha propuesto y nos ha dicho nuestros líderes. No dejen perder una vida por falta de dirigencia, porque la dirigencia está. Nuestro líder está haciendo lo que Dios lo ha mandado a hacer. ¿Qué? Salvar vidas. El salvador de todos los saboneros.